Mic check, 1, 2. Welcome, welcome. Okay. I'm going to start with a little introduction using this book, and I've added some links here because we're going to be kind of addressing globalization inevitably throughout this conversation, with economic development, growth, and welfare being so driven by globalization in the past, this century and the previous one, kind of characterized the entire previous century. And this century, I think by no coincidence at all, has started to polarize people into having more or less faith in globalization and the monetary system from which it is derived from. So I'm one of those people that is kind of a slow starter. So if you're getting bored, stay with me. It's like those fighters who need to take a couple of shots in the face before they realize they're in a fight. That's kind of like me. Plus, teaching to a camera and microphone in an empty room, it doesn't really get the blood going as much as a classroom full of students who are eager or not so eager to learn. So it'll take me some time to get used to this medium of just teaching to a hypothetical audience. But thank you for watching in any case, whether it's live or the pre-recorded or the recorded version of the live or the edited version, which will be added to the video section of my channel, or indeed any of the shorts that will be produced out of this stream/video. Go juice. Right here. Okay. So, story time from Charles Handy. The World and Its Welfare. That's the title of the stream. So I'm going to try and keep refocusing myself back to that. Here in my OneNote, in the class notebook, as it were, I've got my lesson on globalization, which I will probably, I will definitely be shooting a video of this that kind of breaks down a lot of the policies that are emerging out of the Trump administration within the scope of A-level, GCSE, and IB, kind of up to first-year university, economics and business, maybe reaching a little deeper in the business side of those curriculums anyway, or doing my best anyway to try and contextualize the specifications, the curriculums of these subjects with the real world, because as we see here, and let's begin. I don't know if you can read that. I'll get you a little zoomed in. Here you go. Mic check, 1, 2. The chat box is live. It's overlaid onto the textbook, the book right here, as it were. So please do chip in your opinions, your thoughts, your questions, either in the chat or in the comment section below if you're watching. And I promise you, I will answer those questions as academically and unbiased as possible. So, the world and its welfare. Economists are notorious for using 3 long words where one short word will do. This is one reason why the subject of economics, which in fact revolves around a handful of essentially simple concepts, has gained an undeserved reputation among its students for being horrendously difficult. Pause. Not just the students, but also the teachers, the heads of departments, head teachers, deans, etc., who tend to kind of gate access to this kind of knowledge and information by putting it on the same sort of level as hard sciences like physics at a higher level, chemistry, biology, etc. Economics is nothing like those subjects and nowhere near as difficult. It tries to be, just as much as it tries to be a real science, which it is not. And keep watching, keep following, and you'll see why. Economic development is a branch of economics which has attracted more than its fair share of pieces of jargon, some of which have been inappropriate. It no longer makes sense to talk of the first world of richer countries and the third world of poorer countries when the second world of planned economies is no longer a recognizable group. The artificial division into North and South, with the implications of that the North equals rich while the South equals poor, is neither accurate nor helpful. Japan is south of Bosnia. Japan is south of Bosnia. That's a fun fact. What is a developing country and how does it differ from a newly industrialized country, or NICS, as the acronym goes? What do we mean by rich? What do we mean by poor? In what ways can a country be backward? The problem with many of these words and phrases is that they rest upon unstated assumptions and value judgments. For example, if we refer to some countries as underdeveloped, it suggests that in an ideal world, all countries would be fully developed, manufacturing exporters and manufacturing exporters. Is this even possible? Is it desirable? There is a strong body of opinion amongst environmentalists that some countries are overdeveloped. If we refer to the poorer countries as being developing countries, then this might betray I have not rehearsed this, by the way. It's not my style. This might, where are we? Then this might, nor do I have the time, to be honest. Then this might betray a production. How does that make sense? Then this might betray an underlying feeling that development is what they ought to be doing. Or it might simply be an inaccurate description because developing might be something which they are manifestly not doing. That's a little tricky. But just to paraphrase and simplify it a bit further, and the reference to environmentalists. By the way, this version of the book I've had for decades. It was published in, let's have a look. For context, it was published in 1994. This book was published in 1994. Okay? That's 30 years ago. So bear that in mind if you're watching this. It's making reference, though, to things that are extremely relevant today, like this comment about environmentalists and that we call countries that are underdeveloped or developing, that they are somehow, they're not doing something that they should be doing. A little anecdotal story. When I was studying for my rural land and business management degree, there were a lot of students that had come from Africa. And there were a lot of students, domestic students in the UK, who were like what you would call landed gentry, second, third generation, fourth, fifth generation farmers on what they call, forgot the phrase, a kind of tenancy that rolls over. It's inherited. Your tenancy on the land is inherited. The contrast of having those students in the classroom and the other students in the classroom who had rural land in Africa, of course, being undeveloped or developing countries in Africa, was really interesting. I was a city boy, so I was kind of in the middle, having interesting conversations with either sides of the Mediterranean, as it were, and what I realized and what they're trying to say here, what Charles Smith's trying to say here, is that the fact that what is called developed countries like the UK, like the US, have arrived at a level in their socioeconomic development that is what the current state is right now, does that necessarily mean that that is the exact blueprint that countries that have not developed themselves to that level should follow? Environmentalists in 1994, just as in 2025, are saying no. Absolutely not, because if they follow the same blueprint, then it stands to reason that they're going to make the same mistakes, and it's only going to be pumping more damage into the environment, and we're just going to be accelerating ourselves towards the cliff that we're already heading towards. So, if only more people paid more attention to this in 1994, hey? Let's carry on. In this book, two acronyms are used quite often. MDC to refer to a more developed country, and LDC to refer to a less developed country. Other terms such as newly industrialized countries, third world, or north and south, east and west is quite popular as well nowadays, are used only where they provide a useful extra category for the discussion at hand, or where they are used in quotations as part of data imported from blah blah blah. Describing countries as more or less developed enables us enables us in principle to refer to them in a neutral or a non-judgmental way, provided that we can form a clear picture of what we mean by development. This is attempted in this chapter and in chapter 2. Those staid purists who deny that their economics is normative or likely to have an unhappy time in the field of economic development, because here we cannot be value free. Many would say that we ought not to be value free. It's self-normative statement. Economics is about what, how, and from whom. Development economics is especially about for whom. And this is only superficially a technical question which can be reduced to a set of graphs and formulae. It can be. It's attempted to be reduced to a set of graphics and formulae by economics and by economists. And the reason for that is like I said at the start, trying to turn it into a hard science to make things more predictable. That can never be the case because it's a social science, and we're dealing with human beings making decisions, not AI robots. And human beings are not 100% rational 100% of the times. Nobody is. If they were, then these graphs and formula would be as solid as the speed at which all objects accelerate towards the Earth. But they are not, and they never can be, and they never will be, no matter how many times people try to come up with new formulas to try and make it seem that way. Ultimately, deep down, it is a moral question to do with justice and fairness. That's more on point. And why it's such a slippery thing. If there's anything difficult about economics, it is in that. It's in the fact that it's slippery and elusive to create policies that actually work and to create fairness and to create justice in societies that are becoming everly more interconnected, globalization. And generally, however, economists are not terribly good at discussing questions of fairness. That's the next sentence. That kind of hurts, doesn't it? They prefer to try to deal with what can be measured, and they make stuff up to try and measure things scientifically that cannot really be measured scientifically because you're dealing with human beings and the decisions that they make. Okay, that's the first section of chapter 1. And then it goes on to income, growth, and welfare. We have our first, what do they call it? Formula and graph, the good old PPC or the PPF, production possibility curve, production possibility frontier. It's pretty much the first one that you learn in any classroom in economics. Keeps going on. Talk about the PPC. Some of these points and formulas are broken down a little bit. And then it goes on to development, economic, and human development. Okay. So I'm 20 minutes into this stream right now, so I want to take a little pause and see what do I mean by interconnectedness and how globalization is relevant here. First, let's talk about justice and fairness. That ultimately, deep down, it is a moral question to do with justice and fairness. And previously, where he mentions if, for example, if we refer to some countries as underdeveloped, it suggests that in an ideal world, all countries would be fully developed manufacturing exporters. Is this even possible? Right? So what's the difference between exports and imports? Well, think about it this way. If you're exporting a product, think of a country as a business, right? Donald Trump talks about the corporation America. And if you're an employee, a good employee for it, then you can get good pay. You can get paid well for being a good employee, pay your taxes, you can claim your benefits, and so on and so forth, right? And he's really putting up the tariffs and trying to wall off imports and stimulate businesses domestically so that it could turn into one of these manufacturing export machines again, the engine which built America into a superpower post World War II in the first place, right? Right. Make America great again. Indeed, the same thing that turned China into a superpower, while according to some people, America was resting on its laurels and sort of replacing good old businesses like Ford. You saw the devastation, how Detroit, well, you didn't, but you must have heard about it. And you see it on YouTube videos, how regional economies collapsed in the wake of businesses closing down due to the threats of cheaper imports. That's what this third paragraph here in chapter 1 is talking about. Is it even possible? Is it possible for everybody to be one of these exporting superpowers? You don't need to have a PhD in economics to realize no, because for somebody to be, it's not possible. For people to be exporting, there has to be somebody else on the other end of it to buy. We can't all be businesses selling the same products that we all consume, right? We need an export on one side of the border is an import on the other side of the border. So our products leave our border, and the foreign country's money comes in, gets converted into whatever our local currency is, and goes into our pockets. What a grand idea. What a grand concept. Doesn't everybody want that, right? Economic development, growth, and welfare. Well, wouldn't everybody be better off if we could all do that? But who's going to be buying? Who's going to be buying? And who's better off, the importer or the exporter? The argument for importing goods is that, let's say you live in a country that doesn't have as many resources and is naturally incapable of producing certain goods. That could be anything from sugar to a vaccine or an antibiotic. That's one of the main arguments for globalization, that I scratch your back, you scratch my back. In an ideal world, hypothetically speaking, if that was all done altruistically, then things would work. Indeed, before the monetary system, things like that were done altruistically. One tribe would trade with another because the survivability of all the tribes collectively, there was a vested interest because there was a common threat. That threat might have been disease, it might have been wild animals, it might have been freezing cold weather, something. So if your village didn't have fishermen, but you had dog breeders and hunters, but the village down the road had great fishermen and great boat builders. It was in your vested interest to make sure that they survived the winter just as much as it was for your own people to survive the winter. Deep breath. Any questions? Comments, please leave in the section below, in the comments section, or join the chat. Let's take a look at one of these videos. Hold on. What is globalization?
Globalization is a widely discussed topic. It is therefore not all that easy to explain such a complicated term in simple words.
It is very easy to explain.
Let's start from the beginning with the background to globalization. Advances in technology, such as mobile phones, aeroplanes, telephones, and the internet, have made the growth of transport and communication networks possible. Amongst other things, this means that people and countries can exchange information and goods more quickly and in a less complicated way. This process is called globalization. Globalization comes from globe and means the worldwide coming together of countries and nations. Let's look at an example. Companies used to manufacture products in their home countries, just like the companies Profi TV and Supercolor, who produce televisions in country A. Their products are in direct competition with each other, but both companies pay the same salaries and production costs. They have the same customers, use similar suppliers, and sell televisions at similar prices. In short, the same conditions apply to both companies. So far, so good. Due to technical, cultural and economic developments that have come about through globalization, other companies which manufacture products under different conditions can now offer their products in country A too. That's why a company from country B can sell televisions here at a lower price because they were produced for less. The local firms...
And the reason they were produced for less is because the country that they were produced in had access to resources in abundance compared to a country that had them in scarcity. These are economic jargon. So they had more, let's say, woodland, so they could produce tables and chairs made of wood for cheaper than some country that had less wood or less woodland. If you want a real world context for that, look up how Malaysia's largest semiconductor manufacturer is moving its production from Malaysia to the US.
Supercolor and Profi TV have to react to withstand the competition. And so the world grows closer together, and there is an active exchange of goods between countries. More affordable products are available for more people. However, not only does an exchange of products and economic goods take place, but also of services, knowledge, cultural goods, and even languages. All of these individual elements are closely linked and influence each other. But where there is light, there is also shadow. Because of globalization and this intense exchange of goods, people and the environment often suffer. If a company decides to move production to an economically disadvantaged country, people in industrialized countries lose their jobs. At the same time, job opportunities open up to many locals in the economically disadvantaged country. Many people in these countries work for very little money in comparison to those in industrialized countries. Therefore, they often remain poor and more often than not do not have sufficient insurance, social insurance, or health insurance cover. A further disadvantage of globalization is ecological problems such as climate change. The use of aeroplanes, ships, and lorries to transport goods over international borders is constantly on the increase. This causes more carbon dioxide to be released into the atmosphere, which, in turn, is the main cause of global warming. Even national environmental standards are ignored. This is a further cost factor in the worldwide international site.
Not Malaysia, it's Taiwan. I don't know why I said Malaysia. I'm sorry about that.
Competition, which should be kept as low as possible to be attractive for a company. There are therefore many sides to globalization which affect almost all aspects of life, causing me to think that the chain of positive and negative effects will continue to grow further. What's important is to realize that globalization itself is neither good nor bad. It just depends how people deal with all the new possibilities in the future.
That's like if you play video games, which I do, and I hope you do too. It's a great medium for, it's a great e-sport, it's a great alternative to sports and medium for artistic expression. That's like saying, if you're watching a match, or any match, it doesn't have to be video games, a football match. It's like saying that the blue team is the good guys and the red team is the bad guys. Why? It would be the question. Are the winners the good guys always, and the losers the good guys? It's that kind of thing when it comes to globalization as well, or when we're talking about exporting countries and importing countries. Has China been the bad guy for pushing out its exports to raise its industrial, its secondary sector, manufacturing sector? Is it a bad guy for doing that, or is it a good guy? It depends completely on who you ask, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in China is going to say that they're the good guys for that, or everyone in the U.S. is going to say that they're the bad guys for that. There might be businesses in the U.S., indeed there are, who built an entire empire on cheap Chinese components. Would they call China the bad guys for exporting cheap semiconductors or what have you? I know, Taiwan. So here's a question. Or actually, yeah, here's a question. Let's have this question. Has the growth of cross-border trade, capital, information, and people flows gone into reverse? Let's talk 21st century, because the 20th century was characterized completely by a surge in globalization and interconnectedness that was kicked into overdrive in the 90s with the advent of the internet. Yeah. So has it gone into reverse? Some people think that it is. Some people say that there's a trend in it slowing down. And on that note, I'd like to talk a little bit about what is economic growth when we talk about it. So let's do a little simple graph. I'm going to get my Bob Ross on right now. So economists are big fans of graphs. They make things look scientific. Now, the reason why they look scientific is because in maths you have number on this side and number on that side, but in economics sometimes the numbers on the axes are not exactly numbers. They're values of things, like price. Okay, price is a number, but as a concept, it's a value attached to something. Money, which is not really even real. It's a promise. It's an IOU. Not the same as the kilos or the grams in this the milliliters in this cup, or the grams of this pen. So if where was I? Growth. You may have heard of supply and demand. Most people have heard of supply and demand. So let's say you have supply, there's demand. Demand is a downward sloping curve because if you put price on one axis and quantity, that's how much stuff there is on one axis, and the price is said stuff at a given quantity on the other. The demand, which is a line used to describe the psychology behind the economic agents known as consumers, buyers in other words. So if economics is a game, if the monetary system is a game, there's two players in it. There's the buyers and the sellers. And then there's the referee of that game, who are the regulators, the government, okay? So those players are represented. I'll use, oopsie daisy. Let's go blue. Let's go team blue. For the demand, whoopsies. Now here's one of those, going back to the assumptions, right? That people are always rational, which they are not. And we'll do a red line, and we'll do a red line. Here we go, for a supply. Why is it crisscross applesauce? Because the theory goes, as things get more expensive, here's a really expensive point, right? That's $20 here. If said thing that this is a market for is really expensive, then follow the line down. You'll see that there's only one that will sell. If it gets really cheap, on the other extreme, everybody's going to want to buy it. Let's say it's only 20 cents down here. and they'll want to buy lots of it. So if you do that all the way along down the axis, it'll be downward sloping. Upward sloping for the sellers, team red, the businesses. Why? Because if it's a very expensive thing, then that's an incentive for me as an entrepreneur. I say, ooh, it's a high ticket item. If I sell just one of those, I'm going to make lots of profit, right? One unit at at the price of 20, that's $20 in my pocket versus, the 100 that I'm going to have to sell if it's only 20 cents down here. Only one sucker is going to want to do that. So it's downward sloping, upward sloping, downward sloping. That's the rationale. That's the logic behind this supply and demand curve. That's how all markets are analyzed. And it's complete hocus pocus because not everybody is. Some people are higher risk takers. You learn that in business, a different subject. In business, they talk about low risk, neutral risk, and high risk leadership types who, if you incorporate that into the economics of market forces, the reality would be that the lines would look something like this. And that line, whoops, you get the idea. And that line would change that line would change in real time, continuously, because our thoughts change throughout the day, and our actions are changed from day to day as well, right? Same goes for the consumers. One day, you just feel like having a little bit of shopping therapy, man. You just want to throw some money out. You got a bonus or whatever. So you buy 2 dozen eggs, not 3 eggs or 6 eggs, right? That's the reality of it. This is the theory of it, and the two do not ever line up. What does this have to do with globalization? If this is the market for just this thing, imagine the market for all the things in the country combined, right? Instead of having the price of that one thing on the one axis, you'd have average prices of all things together. And instead of having the quantity in terms of units, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units of things on the x-axis, it would be impossible really to be scientific. How can we add that up, right, as economists, to make this make sense on a macro level? We don't. So instead what we do is we take the value of each market, and the value of each market is simple geometry, if you want. The length of this times the length of that gives you the area under this curve, right? Well, the length of the vertical line is the price, and the length of the horizontal line is the quantity. When you take the price of a thing times how many of those things have been bought or sold, you end up with a value, and that value is the value of this market. Take the value of all the markets all together, add them all up, and you end up with an acronym many people may have heard of, even if you don't study economics or have ever studied it: GDP, national income. Okay? So we just call this aggregate demand. Oopsies. So we just call this aggregate demand, and we call that aggregate supply, the sum total of all things supplied, the sum total of all things demanded, and we find where equilibrium is, because only at where the two actually meet does that value exist. Everything else past that line is hypothetical, right? What if it was this expensive? What if it was that cheap? What would the sellers do? What would the buyers do? Where the actions of the buyer meet the actions of the buyers meet the actions of the sellers, you have an equilibrium, you have a real value in the monetary system in this market, or on the macro level, the economy. So what is economic growth? The sidebar that we're having here. Economic growth is when GDP increases. That's it. When the value of stuff being bought and sold in the economy goes up. So I'm going to show you one more graph. Some more hocus pocus. Let's take GDP and we'll put it up here. And over here we'll put time. How scientific. Over time, and this graph is based just on historical trends. So if you're into history or politics, this is where you might want to chime in and switch on. Historical data suggests that economies over time, their GDP rises, then it falls. It rises, then it falls. It rises and it falls. If you've ever heard the expression bull market, bear markets, that is a metaphor that comes out of this graph. So if this is like a bullish kind of market, a bullish kind of economy, a more bearish kind of economy would look something like this. Hold on. Get your bear face on. Oh, it's coming out of hibernation. Coming out of hibernation, a big old roar. And it goes back into hibernation. Sleepy, sleepy time. Something like that. Okay? Why does anybody care? Why do businesses and stock traders and things like that, why do they care so much about economic growth? Well, regular people care about economic growth intuitively because we hear economic growth for the nation means economic growth for me too. Not necessarily. It's red team, blue team again. Some people will win, some people will lose. Lots of goals scored, but who's scoring the goals? It's that kind of thing. And who's conceding the goals? So going back to what this was talking, what I titled this stream, the world and its welfare. In the world, just like in a country, or just like within a market, there has to be winners and losers. There has to be inequality. There has to be for every exporter, there has to be an importer. So when I said earlier that exporting means your product leaves the country's border and the foreign country's money comes in, well, that foreign country's money has left their country and your product has entered their country, right? So the more we import, the more we need to rely on imports, the more that wealth, the money that I've earned leaves my country and may not ever come back. So that's money that could have been used for a wage. It could have been used to pay taxes, to pay off national debt, for example. Hello, Trumponomics. Speaking of which, let's go back to some real world. Oh, while I'm here, this average price of all the markets aggregated together, when you have an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, this is the number that they compare from month to month, year to year to measure what's known as inflation. Inflation is the increase in the average prices within an economy. Why does it happen? It can happen for several reasons, but they all stem down to something very simple. If there's an increase in demand, hey, look at that, new equilibrium. So our prices went from here to there, or a decrease in demand, or an increase in supply, or a decrease in supply. That's a whole other lesson, but really those are the mechanics, if you will, behind it, and it's pretty simple. The ebbs and flows of the economy, right? The social side of it. Why is it an upward trend? It assumes an upward trend, probably, and the reason why it's an upward trend, again, it's just theoretical because this is based on history, on the historical trends that, on average, and it's not a smooth line. Like none of the lines you will ever see in an economics lesson are actually smooth lines in reality. They just smooth them out to make it easier to pick out points and take those points and then make predictions based on them or build policies around them. So the reality is that the line is like a jagged thing like this, and generally you can kind of sniff out a curve to it and an upward trend to it, kind of. If you have your search bars open, just Google GDP of whatever country you're watching from. Over a period of time, you'll see something that looks like this, and a general general ups and downs. Those are economic booms, economic busts. So you cannot have economic growth without the inevitability of a recession coming. Politicians don't like to talk about. Politicians in power like to talk more about the economic growth that they're going to drive from their policies, and kind of sweep any kind of recession. And there's this entire game that happens in politics at a very, very high level of, especially in the UK. Of kind of leaving the recession to the next party that's coming into power. They will legit make calls that they know might over-rev the engine of the economy, leading to a recession sooner, just so that the hot potato can land in the hands of the next politician. That might be part of their party, or they just don't like him, or the other party. That kind of stuff happens in politics all the time. I'm going to do my best to try and isolate like the politics from the economics of these real world events as I bring them in. But I am not 100% rational. I am a human being, and I might slip into some political commentary of my own. And if I do, those opinions are mine and mine alone. But the economics and the business stuff that I'm going to be talking about it is all textbook. It's all somebody way smarter than me came up with, and I'm just trying to distill and contextualize with the real world so that you can form your own opinions and or questions. Let's go to the next video on globalization, which is kind of a little higher order thinking. My mic's on? Oh, yeah. Whew.
The world is becoming more and more interconnected. Never before in human history has there existed such an intense relationship between international trade, communication, and politics. The term globalization is all around us, sometimes as an opportunity, sometimes as a new challenge. But what exactly does globalization mean, and what are its ramifications? Even though the term globalization is frequently used, it is not easy to define. One thing is clear: in today's world, economic, environmental, social, and political issues and problems are no longer limited to the national level because the world has become so interdependent. Reasonable governance can only be realized within broader groups of stakeholders. For example, state confederations such as the European Union, regional economic organizations like the OECD, or the whole world. Today, modern communication technology and mass media like radio, TV, phones, or internet are global standard. This means that information can be distributed worldwide in real time at affordable prices. For instance, the average price of a telephone call from New York to London has decreased by 99% since 1930. International TV broadcasters deliver information, opinions, and cultural products to the most remote areas. The cost for transportation of products and persons dropped by 65% since 1930, due to low fuel prices and the development of new means of transportation, in particular container shipping. Air freight costs have dropped even more, 88%. The freight charges for a ton of coffee delivered from Asia to Europe only accounts for 1% of its price. Such developments are the result of technological advancements, but there are some aspects which were introduced purposefully as well. Since the 1980s, the richer, more industrialized countries worked toward removing trade barriers, such as tariffs, import quotas, and bans worldwide. Thus, new technologies, decreasing transportation costs, and the liberalization of international trade has made it possible and profitable for major companies to produce and sell worldwide. Let's take a glance at the three main areas of globalization. The economic sphere is of particular importance. It is a major catalyst for globalization and is, at the same time, the most affected area. International exports have increased 30-fold in the last 60 years. The foreign direct investment of companies and governments has increased substantially. It's risen from $13 billion per year in 1970 to more than $1.8 trillion today. Many companies are searching for new markets and opportunities for cheap production in countries with low wages and soft environmental regulations. The number of such multinational corporations rose from 7,000 to 65,000 since the 1990s. Similar to the world economy, international politics is also more interdependent today. Most important policy issues, like climate change, the financial crisis, or terrorism, do not care about borders. Such problems cannot be solved by a single state alone. Politics tries to react by attempting to make decisions in broader groups of countries, like the EU, the G20, or even the United Nations. At the same time, there are more and more international pressure groups which do not belong to a particular state. These so-called non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, are able to exert influence in politics related to their field of work. Examples include Greenpeace, Amnesty International, or ATTAC. A global public forum evolves through the previously mentioned new possibilities of communication. NGOs use this in order to influence politics.
Dirty, filthy politicians. No.
International political problems and the emergence of new global actors like NGOs and multinational corporations.
But jokes aside, I do want to make a comment on how economics is becoming more and more pronounced in politics than it was. I'm 42 years old, so I remember a time when it was kind of just like a really nerdy topic that was just kind of on the sidelines, and it's become really, really popular with politicians. And working on the front line in high schools, secondary schools, over pre, during, and post-COVID times, certainly post-credit crunch times, post-Brexit, around that time, I have seen an increase in the uptake of economics as a subject at A level and even GCSE level and even pre-GCSE level. I've worked in one school that had a pre-economics GCSE classroom that was extremely popular. Every year, it was almost doubling in size. That was around just around the time that the pandemic hit.
Lead to a decrease of the political latitude of single states, especially of small states. Use this in order to influence politics. Called non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, solved by a single state alone. Politics tries to react by attempting to make decisions in broader groups of countries.
Right. So this part of the video is saying that the effects of globalization, the effects of interconnecting economies and societies more and more and more creates global problems. So no one country can solve that, right? Politicians are using that as a pedestal to stand up on and create campaigns for themselves that are based on foreign policy. And that's what they're talking about. And when they can't do that, then they court or they associate themselves with NGOs.
Like the EU, the G20, or even the United Nations. At the same time, there are more and more international pressure groups which do not belong to a particular state. These so-called non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, are able to exert influence in politics related to their field of work. Examples include Greenpeace, Amnesty International, or ATTAC. A global public forum evolves through...
You may have heard about Donald Trump cutting foreign aid, and if you remember Brexiteers talking a lot about cutting foreign aid, one of the reasons to become an independent country free of the European Union was to stop sending off money for foreign aid to through NGOs or sometimes directly to governments in their hands, because that's money that's never going to come back again. It goes back to like what I was saying at the start of the lesson about imports and exports, money leaving the country, not sure if it's going to come back. When a country decides to have trade ties with another country, country A and country B, politically and socially, if you will, and economically, the reason for doing that is so that you're helping to build a partner in crime, a partner in whatever. Foreign aid is trying to do the same thing, but let's say pro bono almost, or at wholesale. That's a better parallel. Instead of trading at market prices, it's creating trade at wholesale.
Through the previously mentioned new possibilities of communication. NGOs use this in order to influence politics. International political problems and the emergence of new global actors like NGOs and multinational corporations lead to a decrease of the political latitude of single states, especially of small.
Multinational corporations are the polar opposite of what NGOs are supposed to be, right? NGOs are non-for-profit, and multinationals are the kings of profiteering. So they're trying to achieve the same thing, really, just going about it in different ways. One is doing it more, if you want to draw a parallel with politics, sort of a left-wing kind of leftish-leaning political stance of bottom-up, as opposed to a more right-leaning stance of top-down, using profit for incentive instead of like what social benefits are supposed to achieve, which is giving a little bit of a helping hand just to get the ball rolling, and then you could do it yourself, kind of. It's a carrot or the stick.
All states. The influence of globalization can be observed in our culture as well. One aspect is often referred to as McWorld. The term describes how Western culture, especially popular culture, becomes dominant and destroys cultural diversity. The global distribution of Western music, news, products, and even the English language promotes this effect. To counter globalization, we can also see backlash. For example, people are increasingly returning to local and regional cultural customs. Globalization is a very complex development. Some countries benefit more, others benefit less. Newly industrialized countries like Taiwan and South Korea, as well as the rapidly developing India, Brazil, and China, gain considerable advantage from their integration into the world economy. They can build up their factories with foreign direct investment and infrastructure and sell their products internationally. Due to the low wages in these countries, these products are very competitive on the world market. China represents a perfect example of how the broader population can benefit too. Its fast economic growth has enabled 500 million Chinese to leave extreme poverty. On the other hand, there are whole regions who are suffering more than they are benefiting from globalization. This is particularly true for most sub-Saharan African countries. Such countries are not prepared sufficiently for tightened international competition.
Recall the first few paragraphs of Chapter 1 here, World and Its Welfare. We were talking about the North-South divide, published in 1994.
The cheap products produced by industrial and newly industrialized countries flood the local markets and destroy local productive facilities. Moreover, these countries are not attractive for foreign investors. Thus, they cannot walk the same road as the newly industrialized countries.
Where was that question again? Here. For example, if we refer to some countries as underdeveloped, it suggests that in an ideal world, all countries would be fully developed manufacturing exporters. Is this possible? Is it desirable? Is it possible? Clearly not. Is it desirable? Depends who you ask. And the reality is inequality has to exist in the system to incentivize.
Globalization is both a threat and an opportunity for industrialized countries. On the one hand, they can acquire new markets for their industrial goods. On the other hand, they are facing the competition of newly industrialized countries that can produce at lower costs. Specifically, the production of simple goods is no longer profitable, and very few products, like textiles, toys, or white goods, are still produced in industrialized countries. It becomes clear that globalization takes place in many areas, such as politics, culture, and the economy. Declining costs of transport and communication and the global liberalization of markets have fueled this trend.
global liberalization, one of the economic jargons. When I was talking about the three economic agents, the two players in this game called the monetary system, consumers and sellers and buyers, businesses and consumers, red and blue, and the referee, the regulators, the businesses, the governments. The liberalization means the referee steps away and just lets the two players, the two fighters, the two teams play freely. Liberalization to allow things to resolve themselves.
While some countries benefit from globalization, it has exacerbated the problems of others. Thus, globalization presents both new opportunities and new challenges.
Okay, we got it. So, has the growth of cross-border trade, capital information, and people flows gone into reverse in the 21st century compared to the 20th century, which characterized the 20th century? Are geopolitical tensions fracturing the world economy into rival blocks? Is globalization giving way to regionalization? There was a kind of hint at that in this second video about backlash and the cultural aspect of globalization, which I find really, really interesting. In classrooms, when I teach this, I refer to that part of it as the global gray. I like to paint. I paint miniature models, and I have a lot of fun painting with my daughter now that she's learning. If you take all the different colors of the rainbow and you mix them all together, what comes out is this kind of just gray. If you mix, I'm not sure on the color theory of this, but if you mix, by the way, if you have, I would love to hear your answers and your opinions and your comments on these questions here, if you can read them. So if you take one culture that feels or looks like, let's take visual arts. If it looks like red and another culture looks like blue and another culture looks like yellow and so on and so forth, and you just mush them all together, what comes out is one brown color, and everybody has that brown. That's what she's referring to in that video. If you take music as another medium for a metaphor, if you take heavy metal, jazz, and trance music, and you just start playing them all overlaid at the same time, what will come out is white noise, essentially. So that's what she's referring to in this video. And if that happens, then what really becomes of people's identity as well? You know, if it starts to trickle down on the individual level. A lot of people identify, a strong part of their identity is their national culture, and everybody has a family culture, and everybody within that family has a personal culture. So I'm not going to go into conspiracy theories, but the conspiracy theories that are based on all this globalization and one currency to rule them all, one culture to rule them all, or other ones that talk about the world. They all just want to Matrix style conspiracy theories that talk about turning us all into predictable robots so that everybody's individual culture is the same thing. Going back to the economics of that, when I was talking about heuristics versus heuristic decision making, that's deciding with your heart rather than your mind, which is rational or supposed to be rational, but they're not rational. In theory, it's supposed to be turning us all into more rational consumers, rational entrepreneurs, in order to make decisions that are made within those roles more predictable, in order to make the efficacy of policy greater. Ask an economist if that's a bad thing. Ask anyone else if it's a bad thing. You know, depends on who you ask. Like I said, it's very elusive. It's a slippery thing. But I want to dig up who actually said this quote, because it was somebody smarter than me who said something about economists create an economist's real job is to create jobs for more economists. I think it's something like that. Somebody said that. I don't remember who said it. Some philosopher. When I was talking before about GDP, right? So that's a nice segue into the next section of the book, which I promised I would read. So, published in 1994. Here we go. Where are we? Here we are. Income, growth, and welfare. How can we measure income? I just showed you guys. Oopsies. My Bob Ross moment. The Bob Ross corner. There we go. A little bit of shade here. Okay. How can we measure income? What do we mean by growth? Is it a growth in income necessarily? Is growth in income necessarily the same thing as increase in living standards? What do you think? I was having this conversation this morning about income versus wealth and inequality and how we measure quality of life. I think the conversation went along the lines of, isn't getting from point A to point B in an air-conditioned vehicle better than walking there? It depends on who you ask, right? Is the person walking that distance have a higher quality of life than the person who is driving an air-conditioned car? Are living standards the same as the same thing? Are living standards the same thing as welfare? Another good question. So the next part talks about national income. National income can be defined as the total value of a factor of income in one country in 1 year. This little graph that I showed you here. This value of the markets, sum total added up, value of all goods, etc., etc. However, economists recognize the national income is created by the output of goods and services and by expenditure on those goods and services. So GDP is a very common measure for living standards in a country. If you have a bigger one, your country has better quality of life than another country. I don't think that's necessarily true, and because it isn't. There are some people within a country that has very high GDP that are absolutely miserable, living very poor health, very unhappy, unable to reach the self-actualization that a human being deserves, access to food and water, let alone access to spiritual and personal endeavors. Where you go to another country that has a tiny little GDP and you find a Happy Joe Lucky who lives in his village or on the beach, and perfect health, perfect happiness, access to everything that he could ever want or dream of, with no fear or envy of anything. So, are they the same thing as welfare? Well, let's see. However, the economists recognize that national blah, blah, blah. One person's expenditure is another person's income. Like I was saying about imports and exports in the context of the news that's been buzzing around the internet here. Remember, the exports and imports are the economic component to globalization. It's not the only component. That little sidebar we had about culture, that's the point of that. The other extreme of the economic component is the cultural aspect of it. So when we talk about imports and exports and all the policies that Donald Trump is talking about, it's just one little slither of what globalization actually is. Every time you consider going to study abroad or you're looking at jobs in another country, that is the interconnectedness of people. And when you go there, you're taking your personal culture, for sure, with you, your national culture to a greater or lesser degree, and the global or the popular culture, pop culture, if you're into that kind of thing. One person's expenditure is another person's income, and yet another person's output. Output, the exporting countries, right? Thus, if you purchase a new vehicle, a new bicycle, this represents expenditure to you, but income to the seller. It also represents a quantity of output. That Q on the little graph here. Quantity of output. Let me show you. Here we go. This stuff here. It also represents a quantity of output from the bicycle industry. So I was talking about this graph being a market for stuff. Let's now say that it's a market for bicycles. Statisticians who calculate national income figures therefore use three methods: expenditure method, output method, and income method. All this fancy stuff is really just saying is that if you measure the value of all the stuff in an economy, or the value of all the, let's say bicycles, let's do microeconomics bicycle, right? Macroeconomics economy. Same exact pseudoscience behind both of them. So the value of the market for bicycles, where was I? Oh yeah, if we use the expenditure method, then we count the value of all the money that went across the till, that left the hand of the buyer of team blue and into the team red, right? That's it. Now, if we go on the other side of the till and we measure the money from that went into the till, the goals that team blue scored, as opposed to the goals that team red conceded, the number of goals are the same. So that's how you can measure national input, GDP, by either of these methods. And then there's the output method, which estimates the total value of goods and services produced. So the thing that crossed the till, the value of it, that should be the same as the value. That should be the same as the value that has been measured by the expenditure method or the income method. Now, I know somebody's going to jump up and say, "What about the profit?" When it's produced, it's sold at wholesale to the supply to the buyer. They factor all that in, okay? They factor all that in. Taxes that goes on top of it, the VAT that goes on top of it, on top of the profit that goes on top of it. They factor all that in. Economists and statisticians have developed the collection of national income accounts into a fine art. Indeed, the comprehensiveness and reliability of a government's national income statistics could perhaps be regarded as one test of the economic development of the country in question. One more time. Economists and statisticians have developed the collection of national income accounts to a fine art. Indeed, the comprehensiveness and reliability of a government's national income statistics could perhaps be regarded as one test of the economic development of the country in question. What Charles Smith is talking about here is corruption. And this kind of thing is what landed Greece in a very sticky spot with the European Union, because according to lore, they fudged the accounts to make the case for joining the European Union. In other words, the economy in Greece was not actually ready to be part of the European Union when they made the case to join it. Having got away with that, they kept fudging the accounts. And that sort of culture, if you will, trickled down from the highest levels right down to the sole trader, from the national accounts down to the personal bank account of the man in the van, sole trader. The published figures have two broad uses. Firstly, here we go. Firstly, they can be used to help to chart the economic progress of a country over time. Second, they can be used to help to compare the progress of different countries. In short, compare the progress. In short, they can be used for both single country comparisons and international comparisons. But imagine if everybody cheats just a little bit on those accounts, and then you start using all those accounts together, start comparing things in order to inform policy, things like foreign policy and tariffs and whatnot. It's easy to see how a lot of little things can add up to one big mess. And that is one of the reasons I believe that some economies have decided to slowly entrench themselves, like the US, and that the politicians that are doing this, why they have been voted into power by the people who vote for them. It's exactly because of that. And you see it all around the world. So going back to our questions, like I said, my opinion, but here are some opinions of a lot of much smarter people at Harvard University, The Economist, Financial Times, and some other sources like that. I try to use well-established sources. If I'm going to use opinions, I'd rather use my own. So to answer all of these questions, has the growth of cross-border trade, capital, information, and people flows gone into reverse? Question number 2, are geopolitical tensions fracturing the world economy into rival blocs? And is globalization giving way to regionalization? The answer to all these 3 questions, according to some of the information I'm going to present next, is no. Despite evidence of US and China decoupling, these 3 questions, basically you could bundle them, roll them up together as, is globalization going into reverse? No, it isn't. There is decoupling between the 2 superpowers, the 2 biggest players in the arena, the two champions, or the champion and the contender, if you're into combat sports, of the division, of the heavyweight division. No, in terms of the division itself, no. Let's look at why. So global flows have mostly returned to above their pre-pandemic levels. So during the pandemic, I was one of these people. I was like, yeah, man. I mean, I wasn't celebrating the death and the carnage and things, but the silver lining in all of it, I was thinking maybe this is the jolt that people need, maybe this is the common threat. When I was talking about tribes before monetary system, maybe this is the common threat that people need to get back to the humanity that we once had and put some more humanity into the system. Because, okay, fine, the system is not perfect and it's flawed in so many ways, but there really is no better alternative that can work on the scale at which we need a system to work with this many people on planet Earth that has a finite, limited amount of resources. We cannot create more land. In fact, we're actually creating less with the rising sea levels. Anyway, let's not get into geography and geology. It's not my field. So yeah, here's a graph that illustrates how information, people. Let me highlight it for you. I hope you can see okay. People, information, capital, trade, the 4 horsemen of globalization in the video, how those win over time from 2001. Whenever you're looking at any kind of graph, whether it's in a lesson or in an article in Financial Times or both, the first thing you should look at is the label on the axes. What is the line trying to represent? So we have value here on the Y and time on the X. And it's going up and up and up and up. Despite initial declines due to, I've broken it down, despite initial declines due to COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, international trade, capital, and international flows have rebounded. It was a bounce back that surpassed pre-pandemic levels. Hark! Do I hear, something of this? The historical trends. Remember when I was saying that this economic cycle, in economics they call it the economic cycle, in business they call it the business cycle, the ups and downs, the booms and busts of economies, growth followed by recession, growth followed by recession. What are the causes of it? Why does it happen? Look at what we're talking about here. Can I say that global pandemics is the reason for the ups and downs in the economic cycles or the pattern of economic growth? No, not necessarily. It's one part of it. Maybe this time it was, but other times it was something else. It's a combination of things. Why is it always a bounce back, though? Why is it always an upward trend? Policy, perhaps? Successful policy? growing numbers of people buying and selling things? Who knows? It's the Lord Almighty? Who knows? Maybe every theory that's out there, maybe none of the theories that's out there. The growth of international data flows accelerated during the pandemic, and people flows are on their way to full recovery. So the people flows, here's an anecdotal story from my professional background. When I was working for a company that makes business simulations and sells it to university departments, I got to talk a lot with deans, heads of faculties, people who were in the higher education profession, because I'm a high school teacher, I'm a secondary school teacher, and I tutor some college students as well. So I'm not privy to how those organizations and institutions work from the other side of the blackboard, if you will. But they were saying that the reason why they were using more business simulations and there was a greater uptake in remote and hybrid modes of learning, a part of it was post-pandemic, students from other countries, less populated countries, less developed countries, or developing countries, were more timid about leaving home, about going to the big bad city, going to the big developed country to sit in a classroom with 50 other students to sit and sip from the chalice of knowledge of said guru on said topic. It almost didn't seem worth risking their life and their health for it. So that was one flow towards developed countries from undeveloped countries that was slowing down significantly. And real numbers, they were telling me. So from that to people from, let's say, I don't know, Europeans looking for farm work during the harvest season in the UK, or people from South America looking for work in the manufacturing sector, they would start to weigh out the benefits of that versus the cost of it, their health, and deciding not to go forward with it. Now, whether this full recovery is due to people forgetting about it, or thinking it's not going to happen again, or because more people are getting vaccinated, so they don't think that they need to worry about COVID anymore, and there won't be anything like that. That's, I'm not sure what the answer for that is, but it's food for thought. So another reason, measuring the U.S. Geopolitical tensions. While the U.S., what do we have here? A very complicated looking graph that basically just says that on the key points of trade, capital, venture capital investment, information, right? The driving forces of globalization, people, tourists' arrivals. Tourism is an export, right? Every time that a tourist comes to your country and spends money, you have exported your culture. In a way. Right, their foreign money goes in, and your product or service, in the form of photos they've taken, knowledge, things that have, food they've eaten, etc., has left the country. So the overall trend here, merchandise, 7.5% of U.S. merchandise trades with China. The change, there's a decrease in 10% of merchandise being traded with China, American merchandise being traded with China since 2016. That means China is buying less of American merch. Services, 3% of U.S. services trade is with China. U.S. services trade is with China. So only 3% of the trade of the U.S. of services is with China, and that has gone down by 8% since 2016. Foreign direct investment, 1.9% of the U.S.'s inward FDI is from China, and that's gone down. So China is investing less in corporate America. Outwardly speaking, it's also been decreased. So America is doing the same right back. It has been doing the same back since 2022. right all the way down the board, more decrease for inward investment, venture capital. Outward, also 21%, a whopping 21% has gone down, and 14% has gone down between the US and China. Information, all this since 2022, right? Since the so-called end of the pandemic, or since pandemic days. Migration, 0%. Flow of migration flows are with China, and so no change. Tourist arrivals, 1% of U.S. tourist arrivals are from China, and there's been an increase in 1% since 2016. Okay, and this is, while the US and China decoupling is evident in this data, it hasn't led to a broader split into rival economic blocs. Broader split into rival economic blocs, like that second video was talking about. Allies of the US and China have maintained or increased their flows with each other, indicating that geopolitical tensions have not fractured the world economy into rival blocs. This is, let's take a look at the data though, right? This is talking about 2016 to 2022. Then along comes Donald Trump, right, in his latest iteration. And what all the fuss in the media is about right now is that, could this decoupling lead to a more fractured world economy, amplified by tensions between Russia and Ukraine, ergo European Union, United Nations, NATO? No evidence that globalization is giving way to regionalization, though. Here, according to the Harvard Business Review's State of Globalization in 2023. Right there. Rising geopolitical tensions as well as pandemic supply chain disruptions, have led to predictions of shift from globalization to regionalizations. Basically, what that's saying is that, contrary to predictions, international trade and other flows continue to occur over longer distances, showing no significant shift towards regionalization. Regionalization is the opposite of globalization. I try and find a local supplier. I try and market to local buyers and so forth. The data does not support a meaningful increase in regionalized investment patterns, and global flows remain resilient. So, although some small player businesses were forced to adapt to a more regional strategy during the pandemic, the big players didn't have to, and have just found smarter ways of doing that post-pandemic. To the ways they were doing it before. Smarter, cleaner, however you want to put it. So, food for thought. Income and wealth are unevenly distributed regionally and globally by default, as it is a key driving factor for the monetary system. Now, I'm going to shift a little bit away from the economics and the macro scope of it. Give my voice a little bit of a break and show you these videos. Oh, protectionist policies. Yeah, I'll come after the videos. I'll come to the protectionist policies here. For anybody who's not familiar with the key terms that are thrown around the media and all the jargon, but there are arguments. So protectionism is the opposite. If globalization it's the opposite of globalization. So you have globalization, which is creating a greater interconnectedness of things like trade, capital, information, people, and culture. Protectionist policies are aimed at achieving the opposite to free trade. So I'm going to now look at a case study for a startup business that wants to get into manufacturing business as well, not services, the real hard t-shirt factory. We're going to make a t-shirt company and try and get in on that merch trade game with a globalized strategy. The globalist strategy mic's still on, thank goodness. All this wasn't in vain. Not entirely in vain anyway. Okay. Here we go.
¿Y qué crees que le gustaría, o qué te gustaría a ti, que esa gente que está comprando esta camiseta, que sepa de ti? ¿Qué te gustaría que ellos...
¿Qué hay detrás de esta camiseta? Sí, un mundo.
বেশিরভাগ স্বপ্নে দেখি যে বড় বড় নদী পার হয়ে যায় আমি মাঝখানে যায় নৌকা অথবা ডিঙ্গি যেটা ডুবে যায় আমি এটার মধ্যে থেকে সাঁতার কাটে নদীটা পার হয়ে যায়
Una persona con sueños, con esperanzas, que quiere salir adelante. Personas con muchas necesidades, humildes, también con muchos sueños.
Okay, so just an intro to the theme of the next part of the stream of the video, which is the business aspect, the microeconomics. It's microeconomics and business courses at universities. They call it business economics. So it's the economics of the markets of the individual T-shirts. In this case, bicycle industry is in the book that I'm using. Very just accessible products that everybody can kind of relate to. Teachers like to use those kind of things. So this is a T-shirt company, an American T-shirt company, startup, that is trying to capitalize on all the benefits of globalization. So chapter 1, there's a really short video, so hold on. Chapter 1, 3 reasons the U.S. cotton is king.
Our T-shirts started here, or near here anyway, on a cotton farm in the Mississippi Delta. America, it turns out, exports more cotton than any other country in the world. For about a century, America maintained its cotton dominance by using slave labor. Today, it does so using technology.
Technology, robots and machines are not free. At the very minimum, they cost electricity or the diesel that you need to put into them, and the maintenance you need to do on them regularly. But, okay, well, shut up.
This is a John Deere app, and it shows where the pickers and tractors are. We can go into the screen on a picker and see what the picker driver is actually seeing on his screen.
There are really advanced tractors now that you don't even need a driver for some of them. And there is water irrigation systems that are used by AI, smart water irrigation systems that can sense how the moisture in the ground to really optimize the water usage. Things that humans could never do.
Picking the cat off the stove. Driving south? Yeah.
America,
App, and it shows.
Oh, and I forgot to mention, so yeah, there's the macroeconomics, the national economics things, the microeconomics, the business economics, market thing, the supply and demand for stuff, the thing, bicycles, T-shirts, and then what I like to call nano economics, which is what we're going into now, the individual, the economics and socioeconomics of the individual business, just the one business. In this case, this cotton farmer.
Where the pickers and tractors are, we can go into the screen on a picker and see what the picker driver is actually seeing on his screen.
Sure, it's picking the cotton off the snow. So we're driving south? Yeah.
Bowen Flowers is a third-generation Mississippi cotton farmer. Even the seeds he uses are a feat of engineering to rival the iPhone. Most American cotton seeds are made in a lab, like this one and the Monsanto Corporation. Genes from bacteria are added to the cotton to make it more pest-resistant and tolerant of herbicides. There's a debate over the safety of genetically modified crops. For American cotton farmers, though, it's mainly been settled. 20 years ago, there was no GM cotton. Today, over 90% of American...
Side note, with things like food, it still hasn't been settled, although it should be. Personal opinion time. If a lot of people share this opinion, though, smarter people than me have kind of convinced me of it. If we did not have a genetically modified food that was resilient to pests and things like that, that was able to grow in low rainfall conditions, there would be a lot more people starving to death. And then the counter argument would be, but if we all supported organic farming and everything was organically grown, then everybody could reap the benefits of that superior form of food. No, there's not enough land on planet Earth to grow purely organically and to feed all of the people on planet Earth, period. That issue should be resolved. Organic food is a luxury for people who can afford it, and will never be a necessity in the global food chain as it stands today.
American cotton is genetically modified. And all this technology, the machines that automatically bale the cotton, the specially designed trucks to haul those bales away, the high-speed gins that remove those lab-designed seeds, all this technology has an impact. Since the 1950s, cotton yields have almost tripled.
You've been harvesting all this cotton. How many T-shirts did you make?
Oh gosh, it's no telling. Do y'all happen to know that answer, how many it is?
We didn't know, but we went back and looked it up. The answer? From just this one farm, in just 1 year, there's enough cotton for 9 million T-shirts. That's
9 million T-shirts on Mr. Bowen's farm. And here are his inputs of production. He has 13 people, 8 of which are drivers, 3 are mechanics, 2 are supervisors. The machines he has is the five cotton pickers, that big thing that was harvesting, 5 cultivators, 5 hooded sprayers for the pesticides and stuff, 5 planters, they go along after the soil's been turned over and tick, plant next season. Tractors, 5 tractors, 1 crop duster. That's a plane. In 2013, the farm will produce 13,000 bales of cotton, the equivalent of 9.4 million T-shirts. So there's a phrase in both economics and business, which is economies of scale. This is what economies of scale looks like in the real world. The ability to keep your variable costs, the costs that increase with your output, rising at a much slower rate than the rate at which your output increases as well. It's 9.4 million T-shirts produced with 13 people. If he adds a 14th person or 1 more of those big bad cotton pickers, the increase to his production in terms of bales of cotton will be a lot proportionally higher. up until a certain point. Then they have diseconomies of scale. The diseconomies of scale, see that field? There's a certain point at which adding more and more of these pickers and drivers to it, where they'll start getting in the way of each other. And then the increase for adding an extra machine for how much more cotton it'll get out of it starts to swing in the opposite direction. The only cure for that is buy more fields, get a bigger field. So that's a quick explanation for economies and diseconomies of scale. Back to the video. Well, the video's over. That's it for section 1. Why is it number 1? High-tech farming, got it. Efficiency, what I just said, economies of scale. Modern cotton pickers can harvest 100 acres of cotton a day with minimal human intervention. That means minimal cost, because people cost a lot more money than those machines do in the long run. Showcasing the technical prowess of U.S. cotton farming, right? So you buy one machine, might cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it's an upfront cost that then will repay you in spades, in excess for the years to come. Quality assurance, USDA testing. The Department of Agriculture tests all kinds of bales for quality. This makes its exportability very, very high. It means that if any t-shirt manufacturer, from top tier designers in Italy to, I don't know, whoever else, I'm not a fashion guy, that they will pay top dollar or top euro, top yuan for USDA grade cotton. Global trust. Cotton buyers can order U.S. cotton with confidence, knowing it will meet the exact specifications thanks to rigorous testing and controlling. Subsidies. Aha, now we get into some of the economics of it. Government support. U.S. cotton farmers benefit from various subsidy programs, including crop insurance, payments when prices fall, direct payments. These subsidies help stabilize income and protect against market fluctuations. So a government subsidy is a handout, a government handout. And the government handouts that go to cotton farmers and lots of farmers, because farming is a very particular kind of industry, you have to make massive investments and hope that it will make a return later in the year, come harvesting season and then selling season, right? So to create those kind of insurances, the government says, look, plant your crops, and if we're going to have bad weather this year, we'll buy your product off you, for example, even if it is just to dump it in the street. Or they say, if there's going to be really good weather in another country, which creates a threat to us, you being able to sell yours, we will be able to make up the difference in the price fall in your revenue. Basically, we'll give you the money. We'll give you a government grant to make up for the revenue that you had planned or anticipated for your sales forecast. If your sales forecast is off, basically, we'll top you up so you can have enough money to plan for the next season and not go out of business. Because that's all it takes for some farms. One bad season and you're done. You're bankrupt. These subsidies can help stabilize income, protect against market fluctuations, and ensure that this large, high-value export for the U.S. economy, going from the nano to the micro to the macro now, keeps corporate America in business. Economic security, subsidized insurance, and financial support ensure that farmers can continue operations even though, right. Moving on to the next step in the chain of production. So we have our cotton now, okay? Now let's look at the machines. Oh, this is a good opportunity to take a side note. There are factors of production. So the stuff that's being produced, all goods and services that are bought and sold in the economy, they are a combination of what economists call the 4 factors of production: land resources, labor resources, capital, like the machines we're going to look at now, and enterprise. Enterprise is a fancy way of saying, so enterprise and labor are human resources. Then you have capital, which is machines and any kind of resources that require a capital investment, things that are too big for anybody to have the cash to buy up front with. So machines, AI, robot farms, renewable wind turbines, I don't know, that kind of thing. So we've looked at our land resources for our t-shirt. Now let's look at our capital resources.
Our cotton leaves the United States and goes around the world to Colombia, Indonesia, and Bangladesh, where it goes from plant to fabric, with barely a human being involved. Just lots and lots of cool machines.
Cool machines in other countries, right? So it's now been shipped. Think globalization. It's now been shipped thanks to some shipping company that has shipping lines between the U.S. and wherever these machines are, and that's part of our supply chain. We have a contract with them that we have a storage space, one container for that is going to be shipped out every second week of the month. So we ensure that our bales have been tightly packed to fit into the container, go on the thing, and off to the factory where we have paid that foreign company in that country to do this.
Which we set to music. Our cotton first went to spinning factories like this one. Raw cotton is sucked up, laid down in big sheets, straightened, pulled into long feathery ropes like an infinite ponytail, stretched, twisted, and with a final twist, it becomes yarn. It's then sent on big spools to the next step, the circular knitting machine, where our yarn is turned into fabric. It's washed, dyed, and voila, the fabric for our shirts. Soft, comfy, and a high-tech engineering marvel.
So what's this all about? Well, why the recipe for our, that means US, yarn is like the secret formula for Coke. Precision in yarn production. Here we go again, economies of scale. Complex specifications. The yarn for Planet Money, that's where I got these videos from. Planet Money t-shirt had to meet numerous specifications, including thickness, tenacity. I think that's how tense it can get before it snaps. Twist amount and direction. This precision ensures the durability and quality of the t-shirt. Helps if it's with this high quality cotton, right? You can probably use less bits of yarn to create the same amount of tenacity or the thickness of it. I don't know. Secret formula. Jockey, the supplier, keeps the exact specifications a secret, similar to the secret formula of Coca-Cola, highlighting the proprietary nature of their production process. And why, if you may have heard things like intellectual property, and why intellectual property is a big deal. Some people build an entire career. I think they have law backgrounds, and they build entire careers on advising companies how to guard intellectual property as an asset, as precious as the metal that would go into the product they're engineering, if not more precious. Types of yarn, compact ring spun yarn, blah, blah, blah. Denim jeans made from short fibers, blah, blah, blah. High-tech production in Indonesia. Advanced factory. The yarn of the t-shirt company, Planet Money, our t-shirt company, has spun at $35 million factory, at a $35 million factory in Indonesia, capable of producing yarn with incredible precision and consistency. It operates 24/7, 361 days a year, ensuring continuous production. It probably keeps a lot of people employed in that country, and it may be probably is subsidized by Indonesian government in the same way that the cotton farms are being subsidized in the US. So let's go to what subsidies form part of, in theory, arguments for protectionism, protectionist policies, tariffs, very popular in the news right now, thanks to Donald Trump and every other government that retaliates, because a trade war doesn't exist without retaliation. So takes two to tango. Tax on imported goods and services, and quotas are limiting a quantity limiting the volume of imports. So those two things are your Q's and P's. Tariff is affecting the P, the price, and the quota is affecting the quantity. By manipulating these two things, you manipulate market equilibrium, which is how much of the stuff is entering or exiting the country and at what price it is doing so. Basic stuff. Subsidies, also very basic. It's granting money to a domestic industry to encourage production of a good for export. Arguments for protectionism. So hang on a minute. We have subsidies as protectionist policies. Why then is it featured here so positively in what sounds like a very pro-globalization case study from Planet Money? Any ideas? So they're protecting the cotton industry so that the US can be a strong exporter of cotton and not force companies like us, the t-shirt company, to have to import Egyptian cotton. Protectionism, not so much pro-globalization, right? For Indonesia, they're doing the same thing. They're ensuring that their secret recipe for creating yarn keeps us coming back for more business, because we're paying them to spin it together, so that we don't use a domestic producer. We're probably not using a domestic manufacturing one because there are none available, and maybe there were some way back in the day, and there's none left because these guys created a secret recipe and worked 24/7 and so on. So let's move on to the next video and then touch on tariffs when we get to the end of it. Labor market. So we've done capital, we've done land resources in the first two, and now let's look at the labor side of it, the people side.
Our men's t-shirt was made here, in this factory, in Bangladesh. Here's one of the people who made it.
এরপরে মিলানোর পরে সোল্ডার করবে আবার লগে এখানে টপ স্টিচ হবে একটা
Our women's t-shirt was made here, in this factory, in Colombia.
Ay, ¿cómo hizo para conseguirla? La punta es lo más importante de la camiseta. Es lo que le da la apariencia a la camisa.
Doris and Jasmine share a job, but they're separated by the economic realities of the countries they live in. Bangladesh is much poorer than Colombia. And the role the garment industry plays in Bangladesh, the role of our t-shirts, is very different. Jasmine Akhtar lives with her brother, sister-in-law, and roommate in a tiny rooming house. There's no running water, just a gas stove to cook. There's a small TV and a bookcase that holds all her belongings. She leaves for work at 7 a.m. each day, 6 days a week. She makes one of the lowest wages in the world, about $80 a month. Jasmine has been working in clothing factories since she was 16 years old. And she is not alone. 4 million people in Bangladesh work in the garment industry. That's double the number from a decade ago. Which raises a question. What has driven 4 million people to work long hours in these factories for some of the lowest wages in the world?
Hark, did someone say inequality? Regional inequality and global inequality? Do you think there's any millionaires in Bangladesh Or anyone who makes six-figure salaries? Do they work for MNCs or NGOs?
To answer that question, we went back with Jasmine to the village where she grew up.
কেউ ভালো সুস্থভাবে চলা অবস্থায় কেউ কখনো গার্মেন্টসে যাবে না, কারণ আমি যেরকম আসছি এরকম সবাই।
A lot of garment workers come from villages like Jasmine's, where people worry about getting enough food to eat and sometimes don't, and where girls are seen as an economic burden. The solution? Find a husband with the means to support your daughter. But finding a good husband costs money, a dowry. In Jasmine's family, her older sister's dowry sent the family into debt.
আমাদের থেকে ঋণ পাবে, প্রতিদিন ঘরে আসবে একটা লোক। তখন আমার ভিতরে একটা জিদ আসছে যে কিরে, আমরা তো ঘরে আসি বেগার, আমরা কেন থাকবো? আমরা শহরে গেলে তো অনেক টাকা ইনকাম করতে পারবো। তখন আমার জিদে আমি শহরে গেছি, যাওয়ার পরে আমি চাকরি করে।
I don't know if you can read the subtitles there, but she's basically saying that in order to pay off the debt of her dowry to her family, she went to work in a t-shirt factory. And she was arranged into the marriage with a dowry in the first place because she was considered to be an economic burden because she was born a girl. Think back to what we were saying about in those introduction videos about globalization, that globalization is an interconnectedness of more than just the economics, but it's also culture, people, information, and capital. Sorry, and people.
মা বাবা টাকা দিছি, হেল্প করছি আর কি, যাই আস্তে আস্তে সব ক্লিয়ার হয়ে দিছি।
This was Jasmine's trade-off. Long hours, monotonous low-wage job. But in a factory, she says, that feels safe, better than others she's worked in. An improvement, however slight, over a life of even more crushing poverty in her village. About what I said, inequality needing to exist in the monetary system, this factory that she's working in is better than the one she was working in before. So she's happy to keep going to it. Not because it's a good one necessarily, but because it's better than the last one that she had. So it's like whether, your first car was your first means of transportation was walking, and then you get a bicycle, which is better, and then you get a hatchback, which is better, but you're aware of what is better because the neighbor has a bicycle when you were walking. That's what I mean when I say it's a prerequisite for a system like this to work. In the middle of our t-shirt project, the worst garment industry disaster in history happened in Bangladesh. The factory collapse at Rana Plaza. Suddenly, the world was considering questions that we'd been considering. Who are the people that make our clothes? What are their lives like? More than 1,000 people died that day. They died seeking the same things that Jasmine was seeking. A few more calories in their diet, the chance maybe to pay off a debt. They died, in other words, trying to make the same trade-off that Jasmine had, a life of extreme poverty for one slightly better off.
Voila!
Our women's t-shirt was made in a country with a much more advanced economy, Colombia. Things there are different. Doris Restrepo lives there with her mother in a small apartment, and she supports the two of them on the salary she earns at the factory where our shirts were made.
Yo me imagino que las personas que van a usar esa...
I just want to comment on the style, the color scheme here, the choices.
La camiseta son personas de Estados Unidos, gringos, gordos. Me imagino a las personas gordas porque las camisetas que hacemos así como inmensas, y ahí sabemos que es para personas gigantes.
I don't know if you could read what she was saying there, but she was talking about how a lot of the products that they make get exported to the U.S., where American people tend to be a lot larger, and so they'll use a lot more fabric for the garments that they make. She's implying maybe that they make more money that way.
Doris makes almost 4 times what Jasmine makes in Bangladesh and can imagine a life outside the garment industry.
Imagining a life outside of the garment industry. There's, again, the economic implications of that. And what we're talking about, quality of life and welfare, what he's talking about in the book, the difference between quality of life and welfare. Being able to imagine a better life, to incentivize the pursuit of that better life versus the lack thereof, and doing things out of necessity. And it comes down to the most basic in essence of economics, needs and wants. I ask my students all the time in the first few lessons to make a list of the things that they need and a list of the things that they want. And some things they get confused about. Yeah, everybody says, I need water, I need food, I need shelter to survive. And then some students will reference their smartphone as a need, and others will talk about it as a want.
Doris has a small side business selling pastries door to door and dreams of one day opening her own business.
Pienso que si Dios quiere y todo me sale bien para este año,
it's those dreams that economic recoveries are built on.
The garment industry is just an industry. But in Bangladesh, it's a social upheaval. Millions of women like Jasmine living lives that just 20 years ago would have been hard to imagine. Lives filled with new risks and new possibilities. Most of the money Jasmine earns at the factory, she sends home to her family. But she keeps about $10 a month for herself, for food, or maybe an impulse purchase on her one day off a week. We talked to both labor activists and factory owners about the impact of our t-shirt on the lives of people in Bangladesh. Is our shirt providing opportunities for people like Jasmine, or is it taking advantage of a desperate population? Both the activists and the owners told us the same thing, that the worst possible outcome from tragedies like the factory collapse at Rana Plaza would be for the garment industry to leave Bangladesh altogether. What they don't agree on, and what they're fighting about right now, what more needs to be done to improve the lives of workers in Bangladesh?
So, going back to the cliche, depends on who you ask, or depends on the context of things. Is our t-shirt improving the lives of people in Colombia, or is it taking advantage of people in places like Cambodia and Bangladesh? It depends on who you ask. Or do we measure it in terms of on net, how many people are being taken advantage of versus how many people are having their lives improve? Or is it, how do we measure the improvement of one's life? Do you measure in terms of the numbers of times they smile in the day? Or do you measure in terms of the number of dollars in their bank account? Is it a combination of those two things? And if it is, in what percentage? What's the ratio for the most accurate measurement of improvement, one way or another? So labor market and globalization, the case of the t-shirt company. Historical context, work conditions, historical precedents. Factories have historically been dangerous places, as seen in the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York, which led to significant reforms in the U.S. More recently, the Rana, but perhaps, like I said at the start, is this factory model, is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory the model upon which lesser developed countries like Charles Smith is talking about, or developing countries, are modeling their growing industrial sector on? If they are, then a factory fire is on its way. Reforms and protests. The aftermath of these tragedies led to significant reforms, including a near doubling of Bangladesh's minimum wage from $39 to $68 a month. Those still below the $104 workers were demanding. So are wages being able to keep up with inflation? A classic economic case. It creeps up in the questions of every A-level paper I've ever seen in one form or another. And it's a hot topic for every politician and every economic policymaker. It's one that people are talking about right now. If you go to The Economist and you look up what they're talking about for the U.S. economy, is the top economists in the U.S. are predicting an economic downturn. That means a downward dip in that up and down thing, and an increase in prices, which means that as the economy starts to shrink, less and less things are being bought and sold in the economy. That means less businesses are able to sell stuff to pay for wages and hire people. And if that's happening at the same time as average prices going up, then that's not a very good situation, because you have more people unemployed, and the few people that are employed are not able to pay for and not able to keep up with. So it's either people getting fired and not having an income to buy things that are getting more and more expensive, and or businesses, it's a combination of both, businesses lowering their wages to keep up with the increase of the costs, because that increase in average costs includes the supply of their own things. And this is where you're going to see criticism of Donald Trump's policies if all this starts to come to pass, with the protectionism and the borders coming up and no access to cheaper supplies and cheaper supply chains. The businesses, the small businesses, and all the people who are supporting this won't have access to. They will only have access to local supplies that are becoming increasingly more expensive and putting them out of business. Maybe faster than the threat of foreign imports would put them out of business, is the argument on the one hand. The argument on the other hand is what essentially is, I call, economic Darwinism, which is, as those businesses are unable to adapt and strategize to a more regional kind of economy, there will be other businesses that fill in those places that can and do, so that in the long run, the economy will be better off. And those are the guns that President Trump will stick to if it comes to that. And I'm not a crystal ball person, but it's just that every politician who has been a fan of these kind of trickle-down economic theories, that's what they're standing by. He's very transparent about that. So if he hasn't said it already, he will. Long-term outlook on Bangladesh. So speaking of the long-term, let's look at Bangladesh's workers. Humanitarian perspective. Wage increases are seen as a positive from a humanitarian standpoint. Sure, but it's only relative to how much the prices are. So the money that's going into your pockets might be going up by 5%, but if the price of the stuff you're trying to buy with that is going up by 10%, then you're a sucker for celebrating your 5% increase in wages. Is the long and short of it. Global labor trends, historical labor shifts. The movement of workers from subsistence farming to factory working, that means primary sector farming to working in factories, is part of a global trend dating back to the Industrial Revolution. This shift has occurred in various countries over the years, driven by the search for better economic opportunities. In the current dynamics, the garment industry in Bangladesh is at a crossroads, with rising wages potentially leading to better working conditions, but also posing risks of relocation if costs become too high. It's a big if. So a sort of anti-globalization argument would be, if we're creating countries like Bangladesh that are depending more and more and more on a single industry, and that industry collapses, then we're just setting them up for really, really damaging, like full economic collapse. Remember the aggregate supply and aggregate demand, the sum total of all goods and services produced in the economy? If all the goods and services, if it's not a very diversified portfolio for corporate America or corporate Bangladesh, then all it takes is one bad swing in that industry, or let's say a bad farming year for cotton in the US, if that is 40%, 60% of their customer or their clientele at their factories, that's all it will take to plunge that country into complete chaos. Anarchy in the streets kind of chaos. Next video. Colombia.
Our t-shirts got from the factories in Colombia and Bangladesh back home to us in this, a shipping container. This one right there,
My
that's
favorite
ours.
coffee in the world.
And containers
Colombian.
are the unsung innovation that makes the global economy possible. Containers came on the scene in the 1960s, and they made shipping, which used to be a huge pain in the ass, much more efficient. The container is loaded onto our ship, captained by this guy. The ship leaves Colombia. A week later, it arrives in Miami. Our container with our shirts inside then gets loaded back onto a truck. And then onto a train, where it makes its way north. And this whole journey, thousands of miles, ships, trains, and trucks, cost just pennies per shirt. A tiny fraction of the cost of the raw materials in our shirt. Far less than the cost to print the design on our shirt. And a drop in the bucket compared to what it costs our shirts to take the final leg of the journey, from our warehouse to you. So here's to you, shipping container, the humble hero of the global economy.
Remember what I mentioned about people making an entire career off of intellectual property? If you know about 3D printers would be a very interesting, really shake up globalization, which is driven, the hero of globalization, shipping, container transportation, etc. Imagine if instead of having to export the product, you could just export the schematic for the product straight to the consumer, who could print it in their basement. Now that would be a game changer, wouldn't it? So that all people are actually buying is, or leasing is, the intellectual property to the design or the schematics of that said product. All right, so why you can send a t-shirt for pennies, shipping containers. So this is basically the economies of scale of shipping. Before, containers loading and unloading ships was labor intensive, so we take the people out of it and just put robots into it. Same as on the other side of the spectrum, the farmer with his tractor. Impact on global supply chains, efficiency and cost reduction. Standardized containers enable a global distribution system where goods can be easily moved from ships to trucks. They don't even, So you've seen the trucks carrying those containers. They just get lifted right off of one truck, or the product gets put on the truck container at the farm, and then it doesn't come back out. It doesn't even come out of that container until it arrives at the factory in Bangladesh. Huge cost savings, huge economies of scale. Tariffs and trade policies. Here we go. Influence of tariffs. Tariffs are taxes imposed on imported or exported goods, affecting production costs and pricing strategies. They can disrupt global supply chains by making imported goods more expensive, encouraging companies to adapt their sourcing and production strategies, perhaps to a more regional, local supplier, or a supplier that is part of the trading bloc, like in the EU. And that's that. So adapting supply chains, companies may diversify sourcing, to develop localized production, or establish assembly facilities in low tariff regions to mitigate the impact of tariffs. And not only, linking to the previous case, the previous stuff we were talking about, the post-COVID bounce back. And then what I was saying about companies diversifying their sourcing in order to make themselves more, not just tariff and policy resilient, but also pandemic resilient, if you want. These strategies help maintain a resilient and cost-effective supply chain. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, is what the nanoeconomics of this is saying here. So implications for global trade and economy. I've highlighted a few things here. It's been 2 hours. If you're still here, you just joined in. This is some of the news that happened. This is some of the videos in the news from the trade war, the kickoff of the trade war. Last week, this stuff came out, and now it's really going into full swing. Speaking of tariffs, Donald Trump speaks at the Business Roundtable as markets react to the tariffs, the announcement of the tariffs, and uncertainty. Uncertainty is a term economists use to explain those ups and downs in the economic cycle. I'm going to do a quick my little Bob Ross moment again here real quick and ask you a question. If you have one economy, it's a blue economy, where that's the historical trend over the past, let's not say years, let's say the past 2 years, okay, not decades, versus, let's pick this green one here, a green economy that kind of goes a little bit like this. Well, really slow, low ups and downs. Which out of the two looks like, if you were the people living in country A, or the businesses planning their production and the consumers planning their consumption, did I say that right? Producers planning their production and consumers planning their consumption in country A versus those in country B, who will feel more certain about the future? You're probably going to say, I hope you're going to say, those in country A, right? The fluctuations, the shocks are slower, more gentle, which creates an environment that is easier for you to plan. If you know that whatever you paid for eggs today is going to be more or less what you're going to pay for next week, you're not going to hoard eggs or toilet paper, for that matter. If you know that the economy is slowly slowing down or slowly rising up, so you're slowly having less competitors or slowly having more competitors, it creates for an environment that you're more comfortable with planning or going into business or buying that second factory. That's the certainty. That's when economists use the word certainty. Tariffs and uncertainty is the opposite of that. I think this is a pretty long video. I think it's a couple of minutes though. I don't remember, I planned this lesson a week ago, so bear with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, for a conversation with Chuck Robbins of Cisco.
Yeah, it's 8 minutes.
I'm delighted to ask you to join me in welcoming back to the
let's
business.
Have a look for some real world context.
Thank you very much.
See if any of it's relevant.
Good group out there. That's a good. Don't get better, actually.
Oh, shucks, you're making me blush.
Mr. President, thank you for
Donnie?
being here. Thank you for coming back to the Business Roundtable. We're very honored that you would agree to accept our invitation in the first BRT meeting after your inauguration.
That's true. Actually, that's true. And I have a lot of friends in the audience, a couple that I don't like particularly much, but for the most part, very good.
And as we were talking about backstage, this is the largest attendance that we've ever had at a Business Roundtable meeting.
Well, it's a great honor. Thank you.
So if you don't mind, we'll jump in.
Okay.
Please.
So first of all, congratulations on the ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia today. That was hugely significant, as you know.
Well, it's Ukraine, but we hope to get Russia. It turned out to be I've been saying that Russia's been easier to deal with so far than Ukraine, which is not supposed to be the way it is, but it is, and we hope to get Russia. But we have a
root out wasteful spending in the federal government. Obviously, you're very interested in all the conversations going on around trade and tariffs that are important here. And then you've also had a large-scale effort to root out wasteful spending in the federal government. And I believe there's a thread that kind of ties all that together.
The wasteful spending is the Doge kind of stuff, like every government employee, every employee for a government institution is being paid with money that has been put into the government's pocket from taxpayers. And if it hasn't, then the government has borrowed that money from the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank in the US, like the Bank of England, the Bank of Bankers, the Bank of Commercial and Investment Banks, the people who print the money, so to speak, literally and metaphorically.
And I'm just curious if you could share with us what that is.
Well, it's basically make America great again. We have a bloated, very dishonest in many cases, federal government and bureaucracy that's been a long time coming. Somebody should have done this many years ago. And we're cutting numbers that nobody's ever seen before. Doge, as we call it affectionately. You've been all hearing that term a lot. Elon's been doing really a fantastic job. He suffers a little bit because of it. People go after him, but actually, I think in the end it'll maybe reverse itself and be just the opposite. That's happened before. There's people that they tend to go after one group or another, but basically it's the other. They go after conservatives, and when somebody stands up and fights, their business ends up doubling. You can see that. Just a little example. Goya Foods, he was just a wonderful man, the owner and the family, and largely Hispanic foods. And they went after him because he supported me. And this was the end of the first term. And he fought back, and it ended up that he ended up tripling his business. And it's today a much bigger business than it was before. And there are many examples of that. And maybe it's going to be that way with Elon. When I saw what was happening with this, the concerted effort by paid, I think they're paid agitators. And when I saw what was happening, I said, I want to buy a Tesla. And we just went to the front. He had 4 beautiful cars there. And I bought one in front of the press. It was a very public purchase. And they're beautiful and do a great job. Very good competitors with Mary and everybody else. He's done a great job. And he shouldn't be sacrificed or have to suffer because he wants to help government. It's not that he's a Republican, which he's, not the strong. I mean, sometimes I'm not even sure what he is in terms of his philosophies. But he's a great guy. He's a patriot. He wants to see the country straightened out. And he's done a fantastic job with those. We've found massive fraud, abuse, waste, and we had many, many jobs where there was nobody working but getting a check. We had contracts that expired.
What Elon Musk is a business person, an entrepreneur with one of those MNCs, multinational corporation. Teslas are all over the world, right? So going back to what we were saying at the start, MNCs are the other extreme of NGOs. They are the masters of profit. More profit means more profit to be taxed, which means greater contributor to government revenue, which means a better customer of USA Corp. Outside of that, I don't think Donald Trump is commenting on Elon Musk as a politician, because he is not, and I don't think he's trying to be one. He's trying to be something of a model citizen. Some people call him a puppet or the puppet master, blah, blah, blah. It's all just hearsay, really. I think it's just as simple as that. He's a businessman who is trying to seek profit, and some would say a true capitalist.
Years ago, but they were continuously being paid. Probably, I'll bet you it's $500 billion, perhaps, if you add it up so far. And we're trying to get to $1 trillion. That's a big number. And he did have an ability to do something that a lot of people didn't think of. He'd come in with bigger ideas. We'd say, we want you to cut down the size of your agency by 2%. And we thought that was good. He came in, he said 80%. I said, what the hell's going on? 80%. And largely, I mean, we had to do it carefully, and we had some little hiccups, not big hiccups. But we saved a tremendous amount of money for the future. This is going into the future. And in some cases, it would be 80, and in some cases, it would be 5% or 2% or 3%, depending on the agency. And you can almost, you're all great professionals, the top. And you could almost look at some of the agencies and see which ones had to be cut and which ones didn't. Also in terms of their importance and in terms of being current. So we saved a tremendous amount of money. And I think, I don't know if it's going to reach $1 trillion, but it's going to reach a lot. And it was an honor to have Michael there yesterday. You got to see a little bit of it. We had a conference. And a lot of investment coming into our country, much more than I've ever seen. Apple is investing $500 billion. IBM was with us yesterday, and they're investing a lot. Just companies all over. I could name them. You've read most of them, many of them. But hundreds of billions of dollars is being invested that would.
And they are all MNCs, masters of profit.
Wouldn't have happened if I didn't win the election, number one. And I think number two, the tariffs are having a tremendously positive impact. They will have, and they are having. We have car companies that are not building in Mexico now. They're building in the United States. Some of them, the plants were already started and they stopped construction. And now they're going to build in the United States. It was very unfair that they'd build in Mexico and sell them across the border with no tax, no nothing. They'd take away our jobs. They'd close up places in Michigan and all over the country. And they'd build them in Mexico. In many cases, they were owned by China. Built in Mexico, owned by China. And that's all stopped now. They're all coming here. Honda is building a massive plant.
He's gone from one subject to another. He's talking now about the foreign companies investing in the U.S., getting a little ahead of himself. But that's what politicians do. At the start of it, it's talking about domestic businesses and supporting or subsidizing, but not directly subsidizing, because how can you subsidize somebody like Elon Musk, who is already doing so well? How do you subsidize a master of profit that is already making a lot of money? It's not a good look for a politician, and it's, economically speaking, redundant. So instead, this strategy, I believe, is part of sort of like Margaret Thatcher style trickle-down economics on steroids, where you're helping companies that are tech companies, because we live in the information age. So tech companies is the equivalent in the 21st century of supporting manufacturing companies in the 20th century post-World War II. And these kind of businesses have the capacity, historically speaking, you know, if you draw parallels, remember, waves, up and down, to create fringe industries as well. You cannot have you cannot have tire companies and welding companies and all the other companies that spin off of a robust automobile industry without a robust automobile industry that is domestic. And why be domestic? So that you can have greater regulation. Remember the three players in the game, or the two players in the game and the referee, that is within the control, within the reach, within the policy reach of the government in power, without having to get involved with foreign policy, foreign aid, NGOs, etc., that are subject to the influence of others, and or subject to the shocks, economic shocks, from floods and tornadoes to wars and military coups. That's the side that Donald Trump goes to bed on and sleeps like, sleeps well, I'm sure. He doesn't have any guilt or any issues with that. Ultimately, there is a trade-off between profit and ethics. Not ultimate. This is not my theory. This is from your business curriculum, your business specification. In the short run, there is a trade-off between ethics and profit, which means that if you are chasing short-term profits, you have to compromise something ethically. Take it to the extreme with the cotton pickers that we were looking at, the cotton farmers. The easiest way to make profit if you're a cotton manufacturer is to use slave labor, or if you're a factory in Bangladesh is to use slave labor. Don't pay them. It's very unethical, but it's a great way to make profit, a lot of profit fast. In the long run, it doesn't work. You'll end up with a civil war, or like in the US, or you'll end up with something else happening in a factory, like a fire or something of that nature. So in the long run, it doesn't pay off to be. And in the long run, it pays to be ethical. But for a decision to seem ethical in the long run, the long run has to come to pass. So the economic Darwinism about inefficient companies going under, inefficient government institutions being shut down. How can you sleep with yourself? Some people would say, making decisions like that. And I think the way he does, and politicians like him do, and policymakers who support him do, and the MNCs that support him do, I think the way that they do is they say, we have to turn our hearts to stone, and this is a medicine that the economy has to take, and it's going to be bitter going down, but once it gets processed, you'll have a stronger immune system. That's that. So, populist or not, I mean, it's very interesting that these kind of politicians, these kind of policies are becoming popular in developed economies or industrialized economies, or no, not industrialized, but in developed economies. And it probably speaks a lot about societies in these so-called developed economies, when they compare the quality of their life or the welfare that they have to people in countries that are so-called developing or underdeveloped. Hashtag van life, hashtag off-grid living, and so on. So the EU, off the back of these decisions, announced a $26 billion countermeasure to the U.S. tariffs. Bang! And a trade war is set off. There was an article that discussed the global impact of a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imposed by current Donald Trump. Global retaliation. Let's see what the EU had to say about this.
As of this morning, the United States is applying a 25% tariff on imports of steel and aluminum. We deeply regret this measure. Tariffs are taxes. They are bad for business and worse for consumers. They are disrupting supply chains. They bring uncertainty for the economy. Jobs are at stake, prices up. Nobody needs that. On both sides, neither in the European Union nor in the United States.
On the other hand, if you can weather this storm, you will have less competition and you'll be better off for it, right? It's like when you get a vaccine, it's literally injecting you with more of the virus that is threatening you, so that you can build up the immune system to fight it off later down the line. It's exactly what it's like. And I like the way she talks because she's speaking in very plain, blunt, easy to break down terms. So what a tariff on...
Read this measure.
Tariffs on these kind of products, aluminium, cotton, steel, they are the raw inputs for a lot of other products. So these industries and the prices, how expensive these raw materials become, will have ripple effects on lots of other industries. And so if you're going to put a tariff on something, and you want that in order to have an impact on your economy, you're going to put it on these kind of products, as opposed to like Ferraris, let's say, or Bordeaux wine. So China imposed a tariff of up to 15% on U.S. agricultural goods, including cotton, like the case study we just saw. Best cotton in the world, top grade cotton. Chicken, corn, soybeans. These kind of things are primary products in all kinds of, goods and services. As a direct response to U.S. President Donald Trump's earlier tariffs on Chinese exports to America. So Trump will add a 25% levy. It's an additional 25% on the aluminum imports, which is likely to remain in place until previous on and off again tariffs with Mexico and Canada. the economic impact. Tariffs are expected to cause significant disruptions in the global supply chains and economic disturbances. And that's why, because these are, if the supply chain is like, you know, here, let's draw it here on the thing. Magic marker. Here you have aluminium. It's a pile of aluminium. And over here on the other side of at the other end of the chain, and that aluminium gets, or let's look at cotton. We were using cottons, right? So you have a bale of cotton, and then that gets spun into yarn in one country, that then gets sent over to another country that uses that yarn to manufacture the t-shirt, and then that t-shirt gets shipped over to another country where it gets the print added onto it using the creative input of whoever and glues of whoever else that may have come from other countries, or they may be domestic, and then plop out at the other end of the other end of the supply chain comes the t-shirt. So if right here at the start of the chain, with the aluminium, the steel, the cotton, the raw chicken, the price of this goes up 25%, then for this business here in Bangladesh to stay in business, it'll have to raise its prices by at least 25%. So it can still maintain that profit margin that it needs to please its shareholders, and that will also, please stock markets in that country, so that can continue to rise, so that bankers can continue to trade, investment bankers can continue to trade and continue to make their money, which hopefully they do spend on domestic products, or maybe they spend it on foreign imports, which may or may have not become more expensive. So due to retaliation from France on its Bordeaux wine, and then that gets passed down the chain with a 25% from the first link in the chain, plus whatever they've added on here. So these guys will add on a little bit extra too. And then finally, when the product comes out the other end, it might end up being so expensive that nobody wants to buy this t-shirt anymore, and they'll end up buying a local alternative, or a made in the USA alternative product, which actually will end up being a lot cheaper. For buyers in the US, and it would be for buyers everywhere else in the world if the rest of the world doesn't retaliate by putting up tariffs on US t-shirts. But that's exactly what happened in the days and weeks that followed.
As of this morning, the United States is applying a 25% tariff on imports of steel and aluminum. We deeply regret this measure. Tariffs are taxes. They are bad for business and worse for consumers. They are disrupting supply chains. They bring uncertainty for the economy. Jobs are at stake, prices up. Nobody needs that on both sides, neither in the European Union nor in the United States. The European Union must act to protect consumers and business. The countermeasures we take today are strong but proportionate. As the United States are applying tariffs worth $28 billion, we are responding with countermeasures worth.
What that $28 billion means is that $28 billion, it's measured in dollars because everybody uses dollars, but what it means is that $28 billion that would have left the US border in exchange for that aluminium from other countries is not going to leave now. That's the argument for protectionism. And because the US is in debt, as much debt as it is, the argument the president and the policymakers make is that, yes, and that will go towards eradicating our debt. And then the next question is, well, how's that going to happen? How is that related? How is that going to relate to it? Well, if there's going to be if in the long run, this creates opportunity for domestic aluminum and steel and oil and producers to step up and be the suppliers for the car companies here, or let's go back to the t-shirt company, right? The t-shirt to buy up all this American cotton from the cotton farmer and create jobs for Americans instead of people in Bangladesh or Colombia. And then the money that gets paid for the people that work in those factories gets spent domestically, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then our GDP should rise by $25 billion as opposed to falling by $25 billion as it has been year on year on year due to buying $5 billion worth of steel from abroad. It's as simple as that.
Worth 26 billion euros. This matches the economic scope of the tariffs of the United States. Our countermeasures will be introduced in this responding with countermeasures worth 26 billion euros. This matches the economic scope of the tariffs of the United States.
Which is a way of saying, right, so if you're not gonna give us your $25 billion worth, your $25 billion for buying our stuff, we're gonna raise tariffs so that 26, right? A little bit extra, a little cherry on top. That's about as, going tit for tat and saying we're going to raise tariffs on your goods so that you can't take any of our money. What will that mean for Europe? This is what I said, entrenchment. In the US, it's being done as part of a broader scope, and why I find this a little bit concerning, this trade war that's sparking up. Because in the US, it's all being carefully planned out and mapped, and it's a big country with a lot of resources. And yeah, sure enough, the states have their own state laws that's managed by federal laws in a very similar way to the European Union is. And so that the countries that are part of the European Union are similar to states. Greece is a bit like, let's say, Miami, and the Netherlands are a lot like New York in that sort of way. But it isn't. Going back to the start when I was talking about the power, that globalization or regionalization, and the global brown culture, information, and all that stuff. The US, yes, there are domestic cultures that are slightly differentiated from one state to the other, but in Europe, it's wildly different. Okay, you can cross the border from one Mediterranean country to the other. They're all Mediterranean countries, but there's a kind of cultural identity between them that is far more distinguished. Let's say between Italians and Greeks, or Dutch and Polish people than there is between North Carolina and South Carolina, or the Carolinas and Georgia for that matter. No comparison. Not to mention, if we get into the politics of it, that the European army is a joke. Is not. It's like it's like a joke compared to the national army of the United States. And the power that the United States president has is not. There's no equivalent in the European Union. So yes, they're very similar on paper, economically speaking, but that's it.
Our countermeasures will be introduced in 2 steps, starting with April 1st and fully in place as of April 13th. In the meantime, we will always
April 13th. So that's hold on, let me pull up the calendar. 1, 2, 3 weeks from now. 3 weeks from this live stream, and probably a lot closer to when I'm going to upload the edited video. Looking forward to that. And she's getting a little nervous. Gulp.
April 13th. In the meantime, we will always remain open to negotiations.
In other words, they're hoping for negotiations. It's a bluff. Like I said, this is just a reflex reaction in the hopes of sparking some kind of conversation. There's not a lot of commitment behind it. And my guess is that it's just a short-term tactic to try and fend off the broader context, which mentions other significant effects, such as Britain's hosting of a service at Westminster Abbey to celebrate trade and mutual cooperation among the Commonwealth nations, Greenland's upcoming general election, which has gained attention due to Trump's interest in adding the Arctic island to U.S. territories. More land, more resources. This harmonizes with his entire approach towards Ukraine and the conflict there and Russia by way of Ukraine. It's all about managing the debt crisis, or perhaps the looming debt crisis in the US, having seen what those kind of crises can do to countries like, every country that the IMF has ever bailed out. And the IMF is not going to be able to bail out the US because the IMF is like, it's the US with a couple of its buddies. So we're getting close to the end here. On the point of the Commonwealth, I dropped in something here about Australia and the Prime Minister. So how Australia decided to chime in the rumblings of a trade war. Debate over trade policies. Former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull criticized President Trump's trade policies, labeling them as disastrous, for who he didn't specify. This sparked discussions on broader implications of such policies on global economies and diplomatic relations. So I think there's a very, very big difference between Australia, even though they're comparable in terms of territory sizes with Europe. They're not comparable in terms of natural resources or human resources, for that matter. No comparison whatsoever. They are Commonwealth, the countries or former Commonwealth countries, Australasia. And there might be something to be said about what's happening in Britain there with the service to celebrate trade and mutual cooperation among the Commonwealth countries, and the rising tension. I didn't have time to include it here. The rising tensions between Canada and the U.S. because of the Commonwealth. Perhaps, and I'm getting too deep into the politics of this, but I would love to hear from people who know more about this kind of thing than I do. Just trying to make academic commentary on the economics of it. But the article here that I've got a link and I could share discusses the recent controversy surrounding former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's comments on it. So the key points, he says, criticized Trump's tariff policies and his treatment of allies, means like military allies, calling Trump a bully and warning against sucking up to him. Commentator Andrew Bolt defended Turnbull's right to free speech, while Today show host suggested that former prime ministers should refrain from interfering in current affairs. Stay out of it. You're not in charge anymore. But that's kind of funny because, any citizen can go online. Look, Elon Musk is just a citizen. He's not a politician. And the U.S. government has given him a pedestal to stand on and to share his opinions because he's considered kind of like a model citizen, even though he's from South Africa, but kind of a model naturalized citizen, I think I think that is exactly what it is. And Team USA is kind of encouraging more people like Elon Musk to become, the model immigrants, if you will. the construction workers and the mechanics who rode the ships over to the US in the 20th century and whose backs and hands upon which the skyscrapers were built of the modern era. That's your Elon Musk's and your, what are they, Taiwan chips, FDIs, and what he's talking about, FDI. In the information age, that's what it is. Political reactions. National Senator Mark Canvan and Minister of Social Services discussed the timing and the impact of Turnbull's comments on Australia's tariff negotiations with the US. Treasurer Jim Chalmers and right. So Australia, I think, is a nice pivot point for this conversation where I'm going to leave it right there. A nice pivot point because of its relationship and ties with the Commonwealth and the United Kingdom historically, and its cultural ties and links with the US. I have not been to Australia, but everybody who has told me, and every Australian I've ever met, has said that it's a lot like the US, culturally speaking, a lot of same products and services. So if you compare, like, if American beer became too pricey for Europeans, it wouldn't really bother Europeans as much as it would bother Australians, even though they have some pretty great lagers themselves, or muscle cars of their own. It is a large English-speaking country that is, I would say, more like the U.S. than it is with its historical mother, culturally speaking, the United Kingdom. So it's an interesting prism through which to see this trade war or culture war unfold. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you to Luna Miller for the follow. I said I was going to read this whole chapter, but a lot of it we touched on anyway. See, look, there's a whole paragraph right here about Thailand, Malaysia, Chile, South Africa, where many assets are owned by foreign companies. GNPs can be some 15% smaller. The GNP can be some 15% smaller than GDP. That's gross national product versus gross domestic product. The difference between those two things is the trade aspect, which is a very interesting thing to look at in the context of this conversation. And it gets a little bit highbrow economicsy. I will read the rest of this chapter and plan some cool stuff around it for the next one. I kind of enjoyed this, so I might keep doing it. That's it. Thank you. And subscribe for the edit and possibly some cool shorts that come out of it. I'll have to see. It's a lot of work. Thank you. And any questions? I think since I started with reading it, I will end this video with some quotes from Mr. Charles Smith's here. Domestic or national? Where should we go? Let's go to national income, blah, 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 blah. Economists and statisticians, who I read that part. A study of the National Income Blue Book in the UK government, for example, reveals a wealth of economic data. There is information on spending patterns, earnings, investment, the balance of payments, and much more. Comparing such data with publications from, say, the Indian government would reveal many insights into the different nature of the two economies. In order to assist in such comparisons, economists have attempted over a number of years to standardize the methods of calculation and terminology used in the accounts. In theory, all three methods, that's the expenditure method, the output method, and the income method. In theory, all three methods of calculation should give an identical total. In practice, a number of adjustments have to be made to bring them into equality. Reference can be made to any standard A-level economics textbook for a full description of these adjustments. There's plenty of YouTube videos out there that do it well too. Here we will confine ourselves to a consideration of some concepts which are crucial in our discussion. National income is known in technical terms as a net national product at factor cost. A lot of fancy words when just one will do. Within this phrase, the word product draws attention to the fact that income is not a purely monetary phenomenon. In other words, creating money does not necessarily create income. I have a feeling Donald Trump would agree with that one. What does create income is the output of something real, the production of goods and services. The term factor cost indicates that the value of the output is related to the cost of the factors of production used in production. This is not necessarily the same thing as national product at market prices. Remember that Team Blue versus Team Red graph? Here, I'll pull that up for you. My little Bob Ross moment. Whee! Oh, here's a better one with some quotas in it. This is not necessarily the same thing as a national product at market prices, since market prices can be increased above the level of their true factor cost by indirect taxes or reduced by subsidies. Voila. The word net indicates that depreciation or capital consumption has been taken into account. This is necessary because in the production of anything, there is some wear and tear on producer goods, and some national expenditure therefore has to be devoted to the replacement of worn-out plant machinery and other items. Thus, net national product is invariably a lower figure than gross national product at factor cost, which includes expenditure on all types of investment goods, whether or not this investment is in additional capacity or merely replaces old items. The word national indicates that the figures includes net property income from abroad. This income earned by assets situated in other countries owned by domestic residents, less income earned by, that means subtract, income earned by assets located in the domestic economy and paid to foreigners abroad. Figure that one out. These flows of interests and profit arise from international investment, like Taiwan is doing in the US. If, for example, a UK resident owns shares in a German chemical company, then the German plant contributes to the German national income through providing output income and employment in Germany. But it also contributes to the UK national income when dividends are paid to British shareholders. What a dividend is that if you buy shares in, let's say, Tesla, when Tesla makes a profit that year, it pays out the dividends. It pays a percentage of that profit it's made to all of its shareholders, including you. And that is what incentive, and that's why when you see the price of shares rising, the price of Tesla shares rising on the stock market, you assume that it must be growing and doing well as a business, because for the price of it to rise means that people are buying shares of it. Whether they're buying shares of it because a slick investment banker has convinced them to, or because they have concrete evidence of that growth, it depends, right? And at the end of the day, nobody can predict the future. Remember the ups and downs of the economy and certainty and uncertainty I was talking about earlier? It's all just speculation. It's all just a guess anyway. But that's what dividends are. Dividends to shareholders. So subtracting net property income from gross national product at factor cost gives a total known as gross domestic product, GDP, at factor cost. This is a measure of the total value of goods and services produced in a year within the geological boundaries of a country. So that brings us up to the 3-hour mark, and I really, really want to just go over the highlighted points here. I'll just leave it on the screen for you to read yourself. The implications for global trade and economy in the midst of all of this. Recalibration of global, the key points, the takeaways, if you will, the plenary, the things I want you to take away. Recalibration of global supply chains. Companies are diversifying their supply sources, and they will continue to do so, and they will have to keep doing that. Okay. The shift can lead to an increase in cost and inefficiencies in the short term, but it may enhance resilience in the long term. However, these countries also face challenges in scaling up in their infrastructure and their workforce. Think about things like brain drain, workforce, the most efficient and productive workers leaving or not leaving their countries, going back to their countries or not going back to their countries. The scaling up of infrastructures, how much governments are choosing to invest in things like better roads, better broadband, better drinking water, and so forth, as opposed to shelling out on military budgets or unemployment benefits. Global tensions exacerbate. So this kind of trade war only fuels the fire of geopolitical tensions. Right? People who are fighting, who are thinking about going to war might be more inclined to do it if they don't get their Bordeaux wine or their Budweiser. You know, I'm joking. I joke, but you know what I mean. But the polarization can lead to a more fragmented global economy with distinct economic blocks forming around the US and China, perhaps, or smaller regional ones. Technical decoupling, the US and China are increasingly competing in the technology sector. Right? So that will lead to a decoupling of the technological ecosystems. Think about how different American cars are today to European cars, and how both are different to Japanese cars. They all kind of have a characteristic about them. And there are people, there are sort of kind of the types of people that prefer to drive this kind or that kind. People who drive BMWs or Mercedes are not all that different from people who drive Opels and Fiats. Not really. Not as different as people who drive those cars with people who drive Fords and Jeeps. Think of that when next time you use, or when it comes to using an AI, or whether you're using TikTok or you're using Instagram for your social media, or if you're B2B, business to business, whether you're using NVIDIA graphics cards for your hardware, or what's a Europe? Is AMD European? I'm not sure. Or your cloud storage space, right? So, questions. I'm going to leave you guys. This is your homework assignment, if you will. How will global supply chains adapt? How will they adapt? What are the long-term economic impacts? How will geopolitical alliances shift? And what are the implications for technological innovation? So think about how will companies manage the increase in costs and complexities of diversifying their supply chains? What are the strategies businesses will have to adopt to mitigate risks associated with geopolitical tensions and trade barriers? How will the trade war affect global economic growth and stability? What this entire book is dedicated to, right? But they call it welfare instead of stability. That's what they called it in 1994. How will the trade war, right? So will emerging markets be able to sustain the increased demand for manufacturing and investment from the increased number of people and the increasing shift from things that we want to being the perceived things that we need? How will geopolitical alliances shift? How will countries navigate the pressure to align with either the US or China? And what impact will this have on global trade agreements and economic cooperation, both globally, regionally, and indeed locally? And finally, how will technological decoupling between the US and China affect global innovation and competition? This is a big one for people in Europe, especially to think about. Huge one for people in Europe to think about. I'm going to say it again. How will technological decoupling between the US and China affect global innovation and competition? That means no more American graphics cards made with Chinese components that were built with South American raw metals. All that bye-bye. What will that mean for software programmers and coders in German, Estonian, and Greek startups? What role will international organizations play in setting the global standards and regulations? Think back to the lesson that we had about the quality assurance of American cotton as a primary material, and go to the global standards for things like semiconductors or right up to AI agents. Thank you very much for watching, listening, commenting. Please do. I promise you I will answer any comments in the comments of this and the videos I'm going to make off of it. I will pay you back in kind and then some, in abundance. Cheers. Adios. Au revoir. Yassas. What else is there? Auf Wiedersehen. What did I miss? Ciao.